You can't just come here and do this.
I have everything.
I have every right to be here. This is my property.
The morning began with a kind of peace that always made me thankful for living outside the noise of the city. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams, and the distant sound of birds filled the quiet. Life out. Here wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. It was the life I had chosen and worked for. Every part of it carried meaning, from the garden I planted with my own 2 hands, to the livestock that depended on me, to the cabin I had slowly restored from the shell my grandfather once built. And at the center of it all was the well. That well wasn't just a hole in the ground with a pump attached. It was the heartbeat of the land, a gift passed down through generations. My grandfather dug it with his neighbors in the 1940s, long before the city ever thought about expanding this way. It had supplied our family with clean, cool water through droughts, storms, and decades of change. When I was a boy, I used to lower a bucket into it just for fun, listening to the echo as it hit the water. As an adult, I relied on it every day. It represented independence, heritage, and freedom from systems that demanded fees and dictated rules. That's why when I turned on the faucet that morning and heard nothing but a hollow gasp of air, my stomach sank. At first, I thought it was mechanical failure. Wells sometimes needed maintenance, pumps wore down, pipes froze, but something in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. I ran outside in my boots, not even bothering to throw on a jacket, and sprinted across the yard to the well. What I found made me stumble back in disbelief. The well cap was pried off. Inside, instead of the familiar smell of damp earth and cool stone, there was the unmistakable sight of grey concrete. Hardened, smooth, deliberate. Someone hadn't just blocked my well, they had destroyed it. I leaned over the edge, staring at the sealed surface, my mind racing through possibilities. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't nature, this was sabotage, and I knew immediately who it was. The HOA, for months they had been circling like vultures, sending letters, making phone calls, even dropping by unannounced to pressure me into abandoning my well and connecting to the city water supply. Their excuse was always the same: uniformity and compliance. They claimed my well wasn't up to modern code, though I had the tests and certifications to prove the water was safer and cleaner than anything flowing through their corroded city pipes. But the real issue was control. They couldn't stand that I had something that operated outside their reach. No monthly fees, no bureaucratic strings attached, just freedom. The more I resisted, the more aggressive they became. First, it was fines for non-compliance. Then came threats of legal action, but nothing worked because I knew my rights and I wasn't afraid to fight. Finally, they must have decided that if I wouldn't bend, they'd break me. As I stood there, fists clenched, staring into the desecrated well, the weight of their arrogance hit me like a stone. They hadn't just vandalized property. They had desecrated a piece of family history, a legacy. This was the same well where my grandfather drew water during the scorching drought of '63, where my father taught me how to prime a pump, where my children played on hot summer days as water splashed into their hands. They had destroyed more than concrete and stone. They had destroyed trust. I could feel the anger rising like a fire in my chest. It would have been easy to crumble under the shock, to feel helpless, to give in, and finally do what they wanted. But instead the rage hardened into something else: resolve. They thought they had cornered me, taken away my only option. What they didn't know was that I wasn't as powerless as they assumed, because what the HOA never bothered to learn was that outside of being a homeowner, I was also deeply involved in city infrastructure. For years, I had worked as a consultant, reviewing and advising contracts between the city and private organizations, including the very HOA that governed this neighborhood. I knew how their water deal worked. I knew how fragile their contract was, how much they depended on staying in the city's good graces. And now, after what they had done, I was prepared to use that knowledge in ways they couldn't imagine. That night I sat at the kitchen table with my wife and kids, the weight of the day heavy in the air. My wife tried to stay strong, but I could see the worry in her eyes. The kids asked if we'd still have water, if everything would be okay. I reached across the table, took their hands, and made a promise I fully intended to keep. They thought they could bury our freedom in concrete, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. But they don't know who they're dealing with. If they want a fight, I'll give them one. And this time it won't be my family that pays the price. It'll be theirs. That was the night I decided I wouldn't just defend what was mine. I would make them feel the very panic they had forced onto my family. They had silenced my well. Soon enough I would silence theirs. The next morning, while the HOA members went about their routines, watering their lawns, sipping coffee, barking at landscapers, I was already at work. My mind had shifted from anger to strategy. If they wanted to play dirty, I would respond with precision. But unlike them, I wouldn't cross the line of the law. I didn't need to. I knew enough about how they operated to bring their entire empire crashing down legally, and with far more force than a bucket of concrete. I started by pulling out the HOA's contract with the city water department. As a consultant, I had copies of these agreements and I knew the weak spots. The HOA's deal wasn't permanent. It hinged on a renewable service contract with specific performance clauses. The city had the right to withdraw service if the HOA was found violating codes, mismanaging infrastructure, or engaging in unlawful behavior that placed the community at risk. What they had done to my well was criminal vandalism, and it tied directly to water management. Suddenly their arrogance became my ammunition, but I didn't just want justice. I wanted a lesson engraved so deep they'd never dare pull something like this again. I filed a formal report with the county sheriff documenting the sabotage of my well. Pictures, statements, water test certifications, everything that proved it was deliberate. Then I submitted a complaint to the city council and water board, attaching the evidence. I made sure to frame it clearly. If they're willing to destroy a private water source to enforce control, how can they be trusted to manage their collective water responsibly? It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the precedent. Word spread quickly. At first, the HOA brushed it off, sending their usual condescending notices demanding I remove the complaint before the board takes further action. But by then, the board wasn't their only problem. The city was already auditing them, digging into years of shady billing practices and violations they had kept hidden. One by one, their skeletons came tumbling out. I'll never forget the first emergency meeting they held. The same smug faces that once laughed at my resistance were pale and tense. They weren't worried about me anymore. They were worried about survival. Members shouted over each other, demanding answers from their president, trying to figure out how things had spiraled so fast. And then, the hammer dropped. The city terminated their water contract, effective immediately. That meant no sprinkler systems, no flowing taps, no showers, no washing machines, nothing. Their neatly manicured lawns, which they had obsessed over to the point of harassment, began to yellow within days. Families, who once lauded their HOA standards over others, were suddenly hauling buckets of store-bought water just to cook a meal. The irony was delicious. But I didn't sit back and gloat, not at first. The HOA board came crawling to me, begging to negotiate some kind of reversal. They swore it was just a misunderstanding, that destroying my well was necessary for safety compliance. I let them speak, let them sweat, and then I told them exactly what they didn't want to hear. "You destroyed my family's lifeline," I said, my voice calm but sharp. "You wanted control so badly that you crossed every legal and moral boundary. Now you get to live with the consequences. You wanted me on your system, fine, now you don't even have a system of your own." The look on their faces was priceless. A mixture of humiliation, fear, and dawning realization that they had underestimated me from the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and the neighborhood transformed. Without water, their grip on the community unraveled. Residents who had once blindly supported the board now turned against them. Families packed up and left, selling homes at a fraction of their value just to escape the chaos. The HOA, once so powerful, was reduced to little more than a name on a crumbling sign at the entrance. Meanwhile, I rebuilt. With the help of a few good neighbors, the kind who had always despised the HOA's bullying, we restored part of my well system. It wasn't easy and it wasn't cheap, but the satisfaction of pulling up that first bucket of fresh, clean water again was indescribable. It was more than survival. It was victory. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the land glowed in shades of orange and gold, I stood by the well with my family. My kids laughed as they splashed their hands under the stream, and my wife stood beside me with tears in her eyes. "They thought they could bury our freedom," I said quietly, almost to myself. Instead, they buried themselves. The HOA had tried to silence me with concrete, but I answered with something stronger than their corruption could ever withstand: the truth, the law, and the will to fight back. And in the end, justice didn't just restore my well. It drained theirs dry. If you enjoyed this story and want more insane HOA drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an upload from HOA Karen stories. Every week we bring you the wildest Karen meltdowns, shocking HOA revenge, and justice served with a twist.